In case you haven't met me, I'm Joanne Vaughn. I'm the Executive Director at Maryland Federation of Art. We are a nonprofit visual arts organization. And obviously I'm sitting in Circle Gallery, which is closed right now. So we've been looking at ways that we can connect art and artists and the community. And we decided that one way we could do this was by having a, right now weekly, we'll see how it goes, happy hour with an artist, for lack of a better term. We're fortunate enough to have Will Scott on our board. Will is an art historian. He recently retired from the National Gallery. Like I said, he's on our board and he's on several different arts boards around town. And he agreed to sort of take this over and be the interviewer. And he has selected the artists. Last week, we kicked this off with a discussion with assemblage artist, Nicole Levy. And tonight we have digital photographer, Rich Isaacman. So with that, I'm going to leave it to Will and to Rich to hold their discussion. I'm here pretty much for housekeeping. So with that, Rich and Will, take it away.
All right, Joanne, thank you for that nice introduction and information about what we're trying to accomplish. And I've been trying, since I was given the responsibility to select the artists, to select people, first of all, that I do have some familiarity with, not just their work, but them personally, so that we can more comfortably get into a conversational mode. I will lecture endlessly. My wife will tell you if I'm given the chance, but this isn't a lecture. This is a conversation. And I am a digital photographer, but I started off with, as Joanne said, an assemblage artist, and we're going to move on to all the different media and lots of different people. So I hope you'll find it interesting. Rich is the president of the Digital Photography Club in Annapolis, and I got to know him and very much enjoyed meeting him and working with him on a project for the photo club recently. So I'm kind of indulging myself because I think his work is very fine and interesting. And let's start off with something that's a little bit pedantic, and that is, as you can see, Rich and I are about the same age, and I think Rich had a life before he became a photographer. Rich, why don't you start off with just introducing yourself briefly and telling us a little bit about what you did before you became an artist.
Okay, thanks, Will, and first of all, thanks to everybody for coming. I see most of my family here, and a bunch of old friends as well. If they're not going to listen to me talking, who is? Anyway, yes, before I became a photographer, I was actually trained as an astronomer, and I lived in the Netherlands, and I got my doctorate in astrophysics in the Netherlands. And when I got my degree, which was in 1980, my then wife and I decided to blow all our money and make a trip around the world. And we did. We spent about 3 months traveling around the world. And that's where I first started to kind of get into taking pictures, because we were in all these exotic places. When we returned to Holland, we were dispatched to Hawaii, where I had a 3-year postdoc. And of course, Hawaii is by any measure a target-rich environment for photography. And so I got into it a little bit more seriously there and kind of puttered along with it for a number of years until 2011, when we had a family wedding to attend in Bangladesh. And figuring that that was likely to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, I invested in some decent equipment and then got into it in a big way. But in a way, being an astronomy postdoc in Hawaii was sort of the genesis of 2 careers at once.
Yeah, well, that's great, and it's funny. Maybe it's one of the reasons why I felt like you were a very congenial person to meet and talk with, because I have a doctorate, but it's in art history, which sometimes is a barrier to being a photographer. And the other thing is that I've always traveled, mostly for work and sometimes for personal reasons, and taken a camera with me. So, but we're on to talking about you and your work, and I thought maybe we'd jump right into your work right now with an image that's on your website that I think is very, very interesting, and it's a shipwreck with waves crashing around it. So if you can pop that up on the screen for everybody.
I can do that.
And then tell us a little bit about it, because you've told me a few brief things, and it does seem to dovetail with what you just told us all about how you got interested in photography.
Okay, I am assuming that everybody can see this image. It is a shipwreck off the coast of Namibia, in an area called Walvis Bay, which means whale bay. Namibia, if you're not familiar with it, is down in the lower left-hand corner of Africa. And in fact, it used to be called for a time Southwest Africa. And it was for many years a center of whaling, as the name would suggest. We visited Namibia, I think about 3 years ago, with a small group of 15 people. And one of our stops, a couple of our stops actually, were along the coast when we weren't inland taking pictures of animals. And we encountered this rather dramatic scene there, which just had this tremendously haunted atmosphere about it. The name of the ship is the Zeila, Z-E-I-L-A. It was a freighter, which about 20 years ago, I think, was being decommissioned, and it was being towed along the coast of Namibia to some port somewhere to be decommissioned and broken down. But the tow chain broke between it and whatever ship was dragging it, and it drifted into shore, and it came aground at the surf, and nobody knew what to do with it. So they left it there, and it is gradually being eaten away by the elements. And as you can see, if you look carefully, there's a lot of birds that make their homes on the masts and all around. And the whole atmosphere there is kind of one of desolation. It's a long, lonely beach. The weather is very humid. The beach itself does not have a whole lot of tourism on it. There's a lot of dead bird skeletons. That whole area of Namibia is called the Skeleton Coast. And this is the skeleton of a ship, which was kind of begging to be photographed in this very dramatic surf.
Well, that is very clearly explains why you were attracted to the subject, to the image, and I would be as well if I'd been there. But what do you want someone who's looking at this image to take away from doing that? Well,
when you're talking about a travel image, there's a couple of ways you can look at it, and there's a couple of approaches you can take to it. The most obvious kind of travel photo is a documentary style one, where you have, here's a picture of me in front of the Eiffel Tower at the Grand Canyon or what have you, which brings the place to the viewer. But the flip side of that is when you're trying to create an atmosphere so that you can bring the viewer into the place in which you're trying to create an image that somehow characterizes a feeling. And so when I see this boat, I see this, first of all, it has a feeling of desolation about it. It's almost like something out of one of the, what are the movies? The Pirates of the Caribbean movies, right? With the evil looking birds hanging off the masts. And I watched it for a while, waiting for the right kind of waves and the right kind of surf. And I took quite a number of pictures. And this is the one that, to me, kind of created a sense of desolation and kind of drew you into the picture as though you're kind of on shore watching the ship and kind of feeling the wreckage. Is that?
Well, then you and I really are, perhaps, as they say, simpatico, because that's the way I reacted to it. I thought that there was such a sense of drama, the clouds in the distance, the powerful waves, and the obvious decay. But suppose, and this is a question that's based on my experience as a museum educator and lecturer, suppose after hearing what you just said and I'm looking at the image and I say, but it's ugly and it's depressing. What do you say to that, to somebody that might react in that way?
Well, I don't think it's ugly and I don't think it's depressing. I think it's evocative. There are any number of classical images, classical paintings that show scenes of desolation and destruction and blood and gore and decay. And I guess from a very narrow perspective, they're ugly, but what they're doing is they're creating a sense, they're conveying an emotion. And so it's not so much the superficial physical presentation of it or representation of it, but as you yourself just said, the atmosphere around it. And so when you're trying to evoke a sense of place or an emotion, then you're not really talking about ugly or pretty anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think that was well said, Rich. And we did not plan any of this, so everybody should know that that's from the heart and what Rich really meant. And
this was unrehearsed.
wasn't set up. A lot of your images, though, on your website are much more beautiful in a conventional sense, beautiful light or color. Do you have one of those that you might pop up and we could look at for a minute?
Funny you should ask.
This was set up, not the image, but the idea that Rich would be ready to do this.
Well, since we're talking about trying to convey a sense of place, I think I have one here that's kind of appropriate in that regard, which is this. Let's see, is that showing up? Do you see Greek columns?
Paestum, is that?
What's that?
Paestum in Sicily?
No, it's in Greece. It's
it is Greece.
It's actually near Mycenae in Greece on the Peloponnese.
Yeah.
And I like this shot a lot. I mean, it's a little bit picture postcardy in that sense. I mean, it looks almost artificial, but it isn't. But one of the reasons I like it a lot, I mean, it is a beautiful picture in the conventional sense, as you said. But to me, this is also an example of a photo that conveys a sense of place. You know, it kind of brings you to the place. It doesn't just show you an image of the place. It has the dramatic clouds. It has the low-hanging clouds in the background with the mountains in the distance, and the columns in the foreground. And so there's a lot of color contrast in the picture that draws your eye in. But to me, the whole scene conveyed a sense of age, you know, which of course about 3/4 of Greece does.
Well, Rich, sorry for interrupting, but the way that you're talking about it right now immediately brings my mind to one of the questions that I think a lot of people are curious about with digital photography, because they understand that manipulation of an image is very easy with tools like Lightroom or Photoshop. So could you tell us a little bit about how you process this image, as we say? Did you manipulate it in any significant degree?
No, actually. I don't do a huge amount of manipulation of my images except by design sometimes. This one actually has very, very little. It was, in fact, a cloudy day. I increased the contrast of the image a little bit, but only a little bit. And I darkened the clouds, but the mountains really did stick up that way, and they really were blue in the distance.
Yeah.
And I didn't do very much with the columns in the foreground. I did not do any differential contrast stretching or enhancement. There really was this, because of the particular lighting, because of the low clouds, there really was this tremendous luminance contrast between the columns in the foreground and the mountains in the background. So in this particular image, there was actually very little done, which is another way of saying I got lucky.
Well, I think it's much more complex than that, but in a short exchange conversation like this, I won't go there. I'll make it a little more of a direct question. You emphasized a couple of times that you did not heavily manipulate this image. Do you have a personal bias against heavy manipulation? Or
no, I don't. And in fact, I usually tend to err on the side of too much manipulation because I'm a nerd basically, and I like pushing all those buttons in Lightroom.
Okay.
And so no, I don't have any bias against that at all. I think that, you know, there's this long-standing and completely artificial debate about whether photography is art.
Yes.
And it's silly, right? Because, you know, art is almost anything that you make that conveys an emotion. And to the extent that you take a photograph in order to convey or evoke an emotion, it's art. And so whatever manipulations you have to do in order to achieve the desired emotional or creative effect, as far as I'm concerned, is fair game.
Yeah, that resonates with me because when I was in graduate school, my mentor, my advisor, was somebody who was a world-renowned expert on the history of photography, particularly in America. And so Ansel Adams was, you might say, an artist that I knew about and was familiar with before I went to graduate school and studied with this man. And, you know, Ansel Adams portrayed himself for a long time to the public as not manipulating.
Oh, but that's entirely false.
Of course it was. But he just had this idea that the way that he wanted to present himself was as a straight photographer. You know, this is what the lens captured. So it is, as you said, it's a prolonged argument within the study or appreciation or lack of appreciation of photography. So I'll go right to where I think this is for us, you and me and other digital photographers. Do you have lots of cameras and lots of lenses, and do you think that's important for successful photography?
The answer is no, I don't. I have one sort of mid-range single lens reflex camera that I use for pretty much everything. I have a backup of it as well, which is simply an older version of the same camera that I keep around just in case my main camera breaks. I only have two lenses that I use. One is, both of them are zoom lenses. One goes from 17 to 55 millimeters, the other from 70 to 200. And I use the shorter range one almost all the time. Part of the reason for that is I do a very large fraction of my photography on travel, and I'm not one of those photographers that travels with 300 pounds of equipment because it's just the pain in the neck. I do not think that one needs a lot of equipment. I do not think that one creates art or evokes an emotion on the basis of the equipment that one has. The metaphor is one that I've heard a number of times, which is like this bad photography joke. You know, and I've had it said to me any number of times, when somebody looks at a picture of mine and they like it a lot, the first words out of their mouth so often is, "Oh, you must have a really good camera." And I always answer politely, which is very uncharacteristic for me. But it always makes me think of this metaphor, which is that if you have a meal at someone's house, you're eating at a friend's house, and they cook a delicious dinner for you, the last thing you would say is, "Wow, this food is great. You must have a great stove."
Yeah. Rich has shared that with me before, and it was a little bit of a setup, not specifically, but I was hoping he would make that comment because I subscribe to it 100%. Now, one thing I noticed looking at your website is you had a lot of waterfalls. Can you pull up an image of a waterfall?
Well, first I want to pick, yeah, I can, but first I want to show you one that's not on the website, but it's one of my favorite waterfall pictures.
Okay, sure.
Which is that.
Yes, and that flashed for a moment, and I think that's perfect for what I was really getting at by asking you to pull up a waterfall.
Well,
is there something about water and falling, cascading water that is especially meaningful to you?
Well, everybody likes pictures of waterfalls. And I think one of the reasons is that one of the functions of photography, and you might say the fundamental function of photography, is capturing a moment. And the whole thing about a waterfall is it's a continuous series of moments, right? It's like the ancient saying that you can never step into the same river twice. And waterfalls are wonderful and soothing and sometimes exciting to watch, but you can't, the only way you can freeze them, of course, is with a camera. And so it's so nice to do that, to kind of have this sense of motion and yet the sense of stillness at the same time by capturing a waterfall. And I like this one a lot for a couple of obvious reasons. That is, you know, for the few of you watching who don't know who that is my wife, Alice.
Well, she must like that picture because I think it's just a very vivacious and exciting image. And so we're kind of running through the time that we decided we would spend on our conversation. So before we take questions from the listeners, let me just ask you if you think that there's some place that you're going with your photography that you're not at yet, some goal, some subject, some approach that you're planning to investigate more in your work as you go forward.
Yeah, there are two things actually I'm very interested in. One of them is a relatively recent love as of about 2 years ago when I bought a drone. And in the last 2 years, I've been doing a lot of drone photography, and I've been trying to think of ways to keep building on that and expand on that. I mean, I have a lot of nice landscapes that I've taken with it that I'm very proud of which this is one. And so obviously that's something I want to do more of. This is a drone shot of a river in Iceland, and it won an award from the Washington Post. The other thing is a collaborative one, and I believe when I looked down the list of participants here, I saw Jen Sterling. Jen is a local Washington artist. She's an abstract expressionist painting whose works have these very bold splashes of color. And she and I were basically forced into partnership by Joanne a year ago when she offered us a joint show downtown Annapolis. And my first thought was, well, I don't see how that could possibly work. I'll just put up my pictures and she'll put up hers because they don't look anything alike. And then she contacted me and said, Jen contacted me first and said, I looked at your photos and I love your work. And she was really right out of the starting block. And so I looked at her website and my first thought was, well, and I said to her, well, I love your colors. And actually that turned out to be prophetic, because what we ended up doing was collaborating on a joint show in which she painted some original works whose color palettes were based on images of mine that she chose.
Oh, wow. That's great.
And that intersection between the kind of abstract and the concrete worked surprisingly well, and was just an awful lot of fun. And she and I have been having these conversations about how to continue to pursue that kind of collaboration. So that's definitely a direction that I look forward in if I'm ever able to lead the house again.
Well, I think that's terrific, and that's the kind of thing that membership in the MFA and participating in exhibits and hopefully programs like this encourage people to do, to learn about other artists that are doing things that interest and excite them, and maybe there's cross-pollination. So we've been talking for, roughly a half an hour now. So let's see, Joanne, if there are any questions that people want to direct primarily to Rich. I see Jim Earl wants to ask a question.
Yes, this is actually to Joanne, but the question is, I saw something about delivering the images, the pieces from a show that's completed, and I wanted to get an idea of how that worked, how that's going to work. And I want to ask Rick, I'm an astrophysicist too, and I want to ask him exactly where, was it Holland where you got?
Yeah, I got my doctorate at Leiden. Joanne, you just muted him.
Oh, I didn't do anything, but I can unmute him.
And he muted himself. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, somehow I can't get him unmuted.
That's a little odd.
Well, he can hear you.
Yes.
Anybody else have a question? Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
And you should be unmuted now.
Yes, I am now.
Okay.
But so you heard my question.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're referring to, so I'll have to look into that and get back to you tomorrow.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
All right, anybody else?
I have a question. Did you do a lot of film photography before you started on digital?
Yes.
The 35mm film and.
I did, but in fact, in that era, I preferentially shot slides.
Oh, okay.
And I converted to digital, I don't know, probably around the same time everybody else did, around 10 years ago or so.
That's interesting.
What have you done with your slides? Anything?
Well, let's see. Here's some. Some of them I've had scanned.
Yeah.
The bulk of them I have not. They scan pretty well.
Rich, did you take those photographs as slides because you started out in any way as part of your work as an astronomer?
No, I just I use slides because I liked the color crispness of them, and I enjoyed seeing them on a large screen, you know, illuminated.
Yeah.
It was just a little bit more satisfying for me.
Yeah, I get it. Anybody else?
Hi, I have,
You'd said that there were two things that you were getting into. One was drone photography. What was the other?
The other was my collaboration with Jen Sterling, who's actually sitting next
Okay.
to you on my screen.
So that's over and done with, or are you continuing?
Well, we had one show together, which was very successful. We both sold some pieces, and we've talked about some ideas of other ways to combine our two media. And as I said, if we ever get out of the house again, we'll sit down and try and plot out something else. We actually applied jointly for another gallery, Gallery B in Bethesda, and we were accepted. But then there was some confusion about what month they were going to make available to us, and then the lockdown happened, and so that never panned out. But we both had some ideas about how to pursue the collaboration, and I hope that gets realized someday in the reasonably near future. She's nodding, so that's a good sign.
I have a question. As a photographer, you're an artist. What is it, going back to your beginnings in photography, that made you want to do photography at all? What is it? What is your artistic vision? What is the kind of thing that drives you to go out and do that? And then second, how you moved from that to going into the drone work that you're doing?
Okay. Well, the photography was actually a very natural outgrowth of travel. Travel's always been really important to me, and in fact, I think my mother can chime in and correct me on this, but because she's here, I think my first international trip was when I was about 13 or 14 years old to England, and by now I've racked up, I think at last count, 53 countries. I love to travel.
You were 15.
I was 15. Thank you, Mom. I knew it was in there somewhere. Because I like to travel so much, for me at least, it's the best way of kind of bringing the trip back with me. I'm not a big souvenir kind of person. When my wife and I travel, we don't bring back armloads of stuff unless it's jewelry.
It sounds familiar.
I expect. But in the main, photography for me was a way of extending my travel. That's really what got me started in it. As for what got me into drones, which was the second half of your question, it was pure techno lust. A good friend of mine out in California got into it and started mailing me all these pictures and spec sheets and pictures of his drone, and basically I got jealous, so I bought one. And that was about 2.5 years ago. It was in January of 2018, and I was very anxious to use it. And I took it out in the middle of January and took it over to the Chesapeake and took some pictures of ice on the Chesapeake. And I just had a total blast. Came home and walked in the door, and my wife was sitting on the couch and said, "Honey, I'm leaving you for the drone." And my wife is a mathematician who was writing some complicated computer program, just looked up briefly and said, "Well, the sex will be interesting," and then went back to work. But I did get some very beautiful pictures from that, and so I've stuck with it, and I hope to pursue it.
That's good.
I see a lot of open mics, but nobody's actually talking.
Oh, Lisa raised her hand. Lisa, I unmuted you.
Lisa, you're on mute somehow still, or you're muted on your end.
No, I opened her.
Yeah, I can see she's unmuted, but we can't hear you, Lisa. That's my sister, by the way.
Okay.
I have two of them, and I think they're both on. Can't hear you, Lisa. Type it in the chat, or figure out why your mic isn't working.
Okay, and Jen Sterling has.
Yeah, Jen was going to say something.
So I'm curious if there is an image that has gotten away, or one you haven't been able to get to yet that you are dying to take.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, we spend part of the year in Hawaii, and I got a wonderful photograph of an eruption a number of years ago, but I haven't gotten any from the recent years. And I missed that a lot. I got one that's kind of sorta. Other than that, I don't know. I don't have too many regrets in images that I missed. Okay, so Lisa has asked, which career has given you more personal satisfaction? That's interesting. Well, I've certainly made a lot more money as an astronomer. You know, the rule of thumb is if you want to make money as an astronomer, sell your camera. I guess the answer is that there are different halves of my brain. I've gotten enormous kind of technical and intellectual satisfaction from having been an astronomer, especially having been at NASA. But the kind of satisfaction I get from photography is like from a whole different part of my brain. And so it's sort of apples to oranges.
You know, I'm going to have to jump in here with a question of my own, because what you just said is not entirely what I expected you would have said as an answer to that question. I would need to know what specialization, or what was your assignment, shall we say, for NASA as an astronomer? What was it that you were doing?
Well, what I did before I joined NASA and while I was at NASA were two different things. But while I was at NASA, I was the head of the science software team for NASA's first cosmology satellite. We built and launched the satellite and analyzed the data that basically validated the Big Bang theory for the origin of the universe. And that was extremely satisfying. It was the first time it had been done. And my boss on that project was the project scientist, and he won the Nobel Prize for it. The wonderful thing about astronomy, and before that, when I was in Hawaii, I was doing different kind of research. I was studying various types of nebulae and dying stars from on top of Mauna Kea. But for me, what astronomy means at a very visceral level is it's a very profound connection, not only to something that's larger than yourself, but something that's larger than everything.
Yeah. Well, that really resonates with me, though, because now I can see, particularly when you talked about your NASA work, of how separate they are. But when you talk about what you were doing with nebula and other cosmological, then that seems like they merge together.
Well, yeah, in a way they do. I mean, look, you know, photography is a connection also, right? It's well known that when someone takes your picture, they steal your soul. At least that's the way they behaved in Morocco, which was not a friendly place for photography. Yeah, it's I don't know. It's hard to articulate. It's easier to articulate the astronomy part than the photography part. I get an enormous amount of satisfaction when I look at a picture and I got out of it what I intended to get out of it. Because when I'm looking through the viewfinder, I'm trying to look ahead to what the picture is going to look like when I'm done with it. And so the satisfaction in many ways is sort of after the fact. If I get it to look like what my mental image was at the time, and if I can evoke the feelings in myself that I felt at the time I took the picture, then I feel like I've kind of established that sort of remote connection. Yeah. Does that make any sense?
I see there's a question over here. Eileen?
That's my other sister.
That's his other sister. So here's a question for you, a hypothetical question. If you could go into space, and fulfill both your astronomer, your left side and right side brain, would that be a dream come true?
Absolutely, I would do that in a heartbeat.
Well, you need to talk to Elon Musk if you can pronounce his kid's name. You get to go.
I have a question. Rich, how come you weren't so smart and creative and articulate when we used to work together?
You held me back, Ron.
You're an amazing guy.
That's Ron Trowbridge. He is my former boss, and he has been a very great career mentor for me through my time at NASA.
He's amazing. Amazing man.
We have
any other questions, plaudits?
I have another question. As a photographer, what other kinds of photography do you like? Are there
That's
particular
good.
photographers out there? Are there eras of photography? Are there styles of photography that you admire?
There are, and in fact, I'm really glad you asked that, because it's a great softball question. And by the way, since on my screen everybody's users names are arranged alphabetically, and Julius, right next to you is Howard Levitsky, who is my very oldest friend, and you guys look like you've been separated at birth. For those of you who can see the two of them on the screen. Yeah. Anyway, but to answer your question,
Rich, sorry, me and who? I can't. They're not.
Julius Kasovic, whom I have never met. You guys are next to each other on the screen, and you're like identical twins. It's actually a little bit weird.
Aw. Okay.
It's the beard, I think, and the high forehead. Anyway, yes, Julius, there's photography, you know, like any field of art or any field of endeavor, has a number of subgenres. As we've already discussed, I'm heavily into travel photography, and that itself has some subdisciplines such as street photography. I really, really like taking pictures of, you know, in addition to the usual kind of landscapes, taking pictures of people in various situations that convey some emotion. And if I may, I will show one or two of them. That is a Basque farmer in Argentina. This is a woman in a market in Vietnam.
Your screen's not shared.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry. I forgot to reshare. Let me do that. Let me go back. One of the things I really like a lot is trying to capture a sense of emotion when I'm taking pictures of people, which I try and do a lot on travel. There, can everybody see the farmer, the Basque farmer?
Yeah.
This is a little girl in southern Argentina near Tierra del Fuego, engrossed in her iPad. A woman in a market in Vietnam. Another woman in a fish market in Vietnam. I like this shot a lot because it just shows the exhaustion on her face. An old man in a cafe in Greece. This one won an award also. So I really like this particular genre of photography, of showing people. This is a bride at the bride at that wedding in Bangladesh.
Rich, most of your photographs, the ones you showed us today and the ones I saw on your website, are in color, but the one of the man was in black and white. And why did you present that one in black and white when most of your work is presented?
It was a very somber scene. He looked lonely. He was, I mean, for all I know, he was thinking about how he had just won the lottery, but I couldn't tell that. I mean, it looked like a sad and lonely scene, and it was a rainy day. There's rain in the street outside in that picture, and there's a wisp. You know, bring it back. Hold on. There's a wisp of smoke curling up from the ashtray next to him. Let me bring him back. There. And when I saw the scene, it just struck me as one of somberness and loneliness, and it didn't want color.
Yeah.
It really wanted gray.
That's very well said, and I'm going to take the opportunity to sort of pitch a favorite theme of mine. Not in my art, but in talking about photography. If you listen to what Rich was saying, it's clear that he understood the transition from color, which is very appealing to the average person, to black and white, furthered his aesthetic intentions and really dramatized what he felt looking at the scene. And that's the art of photography. If I could say that on your behalf, Rich, it's certainly the way I look at it. It's those kinds of choices that you make as an artist and use the tools at your disposal to convey something meaningful through your art to others. They may or may not connect with it, and they may view it in an entirely different way. But what you just described is what makes photography art.
Agreed. Now, Julius, you also asked me whether there were genres that I am not so involved in, and the answer to that is yes. I could never figure out still lifes. There are a lot of photographers who are very good at still lifes, at creating an ambiance, with a plate of fruit or, a basket of hex nuts or whatever. And I can't do it. And it's not because I object to it. It's just that when I have a bunch of stuff in front of me, it just looks like a bunch of stuff. So I'm really bad at still lifes, and so I never do it. Event photography, that's kind of a commercial thing. And I've done that a little bit, but only a little bit, and I'm not really into that either. So from a artistic perspective, certainly my two big loves, far and away compared to anything else, are things like travel landscapes and street photography, and trying to create the sense of the scene of some faraway place or the people in it.
Jack?
One of the things that if you've got a background in photography, I go back over 50 years, everything was black and white in the darkroom because color was just too expensive and too difficult. So my mind, when I take a photograph, everything's in black and white. And then I kind of convert it into color and then back into black and white. I spend far too much time on Photoshop, converting back and forth. But, it's that view when you look at any of the great photographers historically, before the 40s, let's say, they were all black and white. And that was one of the main reasons, was the cost. In the 50s and the 60s, when color started to become more predominant, we all went into color. And so I understand what you were saying about looking at that old man in black and white. I couldn't see it any other way.
Right, and sometimes it just asks for it.
Well, and it's interesting, Jack, that you made that observation about the history of photography. But remember that Robert Frank had said that black and white is the true color of photography. And he had all of those options throughout his career, but it was almost always black and white for him. So that's one of the things I always think about, because more as time's gone by, I convert things and present things in black and white, although the color in a good digital camera and good printer is just tremendous. Blows your socks off.
It took me a long time to turn over from black and white to color. One of my professors once said to me when I handed in a portfolio, he said, "This is a great black and white portfolio. Too bad it's in color."
Ooh, burn.
Yeah. Well, not mentioning any words, huh?
No.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I hope that everybody has found it to be interesting. I know I have, and I'm sure that Rich and I can have some more conversations sometime about photography and art and how we do what we do. So, Joanne, what do you think?
No, I think unless anybody has any other questions, I want to thank everybody for coming. We had about 40 people, between people coming and going and back and forth. This has been great. Next week, Will is going to interview Mary Ellen Carsley. I don't know if you want to tease that for us at all.
Yes, I just want to say that I'm glad that she accepted, and you hadn't confirmed that, and I'm glad she accepted because she's a very articulate artist, young woman, younger than me. Most women are young to me, but she is a draftsman. She draws and she does prints. And as I was saying to Joanne when I mentioned Mary Ellen as a possible interviewee, some of her drawings, I think, would remind those of us who are classically educated in the history of art of Durer's famous drawing of a hare, or his piece of turf, another one of his very famous, well-known works. So she's just a wonderful draftswoman, and she started to participate more in our exhibits, and I think you'll enjoy hearing her talk about her work.
No, and I want to let everybody know, we will be we're recording the session, recorded last week, so we're learning how to do this as we go along. As I told the board, I was not hired because of my virtual communication skills. And so thanks for everybody for bearing with me as I learn on the job. But we'll have this recording on our website tomorrow. So you can review it, send friends to it, people who couldn't make tonight. Rich, I want to thank you so much for participating.
I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank Will for making me look good.
Well, thanks for, you made yourself look good, but thanks for agreeing, and thanks, Joanne, for setting it up, and for all of our listeners, viewers who participated. That's what we're really doing it for, is for you. And I hope you enjoyed it.
Very much so. So thank you and good night.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Thanks for coming.